should be all good.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to introduce our lecturer, Dr. Guthrie, who is a professor of ethics and humanities at Hudson University. He got his BA from Duke University, his master's in divinity from the Candler School of Theology, and his PhD from Emory University. And we're very lucky to have him here this afternoon, and I'm looking forward to his lecture very much. I was intrigued to find out that Dr. Guthrie is a clarinet player, an aspiring tiki bartender, and a mediocre car race, which I think is a wonderful combination. You'll perhaps see him around town, tearing in his vehicle. What do you drive, Cliff? Sorry, I have to ask before we start.
Well, the students may be more familiar with it, but it's a WRX STI, and I do love to take it to the track and do autocross. And I try to take out all my energy on driving in legal places rather than in people's neighborhoods.
All right, excellent. Well, thanks very much for agreeing to do the lecture this afternoon. We're very excited to hear your talk. So I will hand it over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate everyone this opportunity to talk to you about these two books of Augustine. And it's my understanding that the Honors College now gives preceptors a choice about whether their students read Confessions or the Study of God. So normally I've had a lecture for one or the other, and so it's going to be a little bit of a squeeze to try to cover both. But one of the things I like to do, and honestly, this is the first time I've done a Zoom lecture like this, so forgive me if it's not as smooth as it could be, but one of the things I'd love to do first is to just ask you to be as interactive as you're willing to be, to type comments in the chat or questions in the chat, or please interrupt me if you want to do that. You can raise your hand if I can see that. I'm not even sure whether I can see everybody's name, but do feel free to do that. So as a first measure, what I'd like for you to do is I think if you open up the chat window down on the bottom right, you can see a little emoji face. I'd love to see an emoji from everyone about how they're feeling about Augustine these days and your required reading. And meanwhile, I'll show you a picture of my dog.
All right, bring him on. A red setter.
She is what's called a golden Irish. She's half golden retriever and half Irish setter, and she's at home recuperating from major surgery. She ate a bunch of stuff that she shouldn't have eaten, and her stomach was full, and so she's at home getting rest and recuperating. It was pretty traumatic there for a bit.
Well, I hope she bounces back quickly.
Yeah. So I see a couple of thumbs. I see some upside down faces, some flat faces. I think is that I'm not sure what that is. A dog. So a variety of things. Nothing too scary so far. I'll just start here by saying that I have a mix of my own reaction to Augustine, a long history. When I was an undergraduate, I didn't even know this dude existed until I started studying theology in earnest, and I happened to be at the University of Kent in Canterbury at the time. And in that seminar, I was introduced to Augustine and told to find some of his stuff to read. The system's a little different there, so I was free, in a sense, to choose. But it was at that time that I went to the bookstore and bought my copy of The City of God, which is something that all young people aspire to have for themselves, I'm sure. But this version of the book, which is the full one, is 1,100 pages long. And I guess I was a junior in college at the time, and I think my experience of it was I had never read anything like it, and I certainly never read anything of this antiquity or of this depth and seriousness. And there was something about this book that woke up a part of me that I didn't really know existed, and it was something like this. And I don't know if I can express this very correctly, but I think as a person, I had been led through my education by various teachers and told, these things are important, here's what you should know, and tested on those things and asked to write papers on things that other people thought I should know. Whenever I was going through at that time of my life, when I started reading Augustine, it opened up a world for me that made me realize that I had a choice to make. And the choice that I felt like I wanted to make was to think about being an educated person for my own sake. What would it be like to actually read serious books and to know about the world, not because someone else told me that I should, but because I myself wanted to be that kind of person who knew about the history of the world and knew about the history of ideas. And so I set it, as a goal that I would read the whole of not the abbreviated version, but the whole version of The City of God. And I took about a semester to do that. And I remember not understanding most of what I read, but there was something about the mountain itself that I felt I needed to climb. And so I've had a long history of work with Augustine, and in my background, I was a pastor and a theologian, and I lectured and taught at seminaries. But in the last 20 years or so, I've not been doing that work. So this time when I come back and do this lecture, it's always a little bit of a strange trip home. So if you're feeling mixed feelings about Augustine, then that's okay. Then you're part of the club. So I want to start by sharing with you a timeline that maybe will help orient you about where Augustine fits in time. And let's see if I can get that. Okay. So let me start here. Most of you as an anchor point would probably be aware, and can you all see that all right? Yeah, I'm going to assume you can. So most of you are probably aware as an anchor point that Jesus of Nazareth was crucified around AD 33. And that's a pretty well attested historical event. And it was sometime after that we started to have writings that were circulated that as time went on, these writings were read out loud to various Christian communities, and then sometimes only like one community had one letter or one gospel, but these various things were gradually collected and edited and included in what would become known as the New Testament later on. But at this stage, we just have these writings being produced. But very quickly into this period, Christianity starts to spread throughout the Roman Empire, and particularly where it spreads is in the towns and cities where I guess most of the members, from what we know of these churches, were disaffected youth. So again, they may not be that different from some of us today. But the fact that it came to North Africa actually fairly early is significant. So by the time Augustine comes along, there's a long tradition of African Christianity. And as you're probably aware from your reading of Apuleius, North Africa was part of this extended Roman Mediterranean world. Then we enter into a period of about 200 years of what I'm calling the age of many Christianities, or the anti-Nicene fathers. And before the the Council of Nicaea, that's all that means, anti-Nicene fathers. And these are, there are various famous theologians whose work was taken to be orthodox, like Irenaeus, Tertullian. Origen, not so much orthodox; he was rejected in some circles. But it was during this time that these writings that were part of the New Testament started to sort of, the authoritative ones were chosen, the less authoritative ones, or the ones that were heterodox, were kind of put aside. So I say that because some of you, if you're reading the City of God, you may come across some passages where Augustine says, hey, look at all those philosophers. They can't agree on anything. And that's one proof that philosophy is not going to help us get through life or give us the final answers. Whereas we Christians, Augustine says, we all agree on the essential truths. And I'm here to tell you that wasn't true. That this agreement, that even to the extent that Augustine would have known it by the time he lived, was an agreement that was sort of forged through lots and lots of conflict. So then I mentioned Apuleius, and you had read that, and that was about AD 150. And you may remember there were a couple passages in there where Apuleius was aware of Christians and had some nasty things to say about them and how they're cannibals, essentially. So skipping ahead, there in this sort of age of many Christianities, one of the Christianities that started was out in Persia, what we now know as Iran. And there was this guy named Manes who lived, and he was a prophet and believed by a lot of folks. And he his followers started a branch of Christianity called Manichaeism. And I say here that it's one of the many Gnostic Christianities, because one of the forms of Christianity that emerged in this time was called Gnosticism. And Gnosticism was, you may know the Greek word gnosis for know, but the basic idea is that you could achieve salvation in Christianities by knowing some essential secret, some salvific secret, and you had to be part of the in-group in order to get that secret knowledge. And so that wasn't that different from some of the other religions in the Hellenistic period, but it's not what we would take to be sort of Orthodox Christianity today, but it certainly was one of the forms that Christianity often took, and that was a kind of form that this Manichaeism had. And this will be significant because, particularly if you've read the Confessions, you'll see Augustine talking about Manichaeism and how he himself became a follower of this Gnostic tradition. So moving ahead into the 4th century, we had a period of about 10 years with Diocletian's great persecution of the Christians. And so there were various persecutions that took place and various stories about the persecution, some of them more serious than others. But one of the more serious ones was Diocletian's. And this is actually a time when a split started to emerge among North African Christians. So some of the basically what one of the things that Diocletian had required is that all of the Christians churches give up their scripture. So that was something that was, as you can imagine, books were very expensive and hard to come by. So for a church to give up its scripture to the Roman authorities or to the soldiers was a terrible catastrophe for that community. It may have been the only, likely the only copy that they had. And so some Christians went along and they said, well, if we give them the scriptures, then at least they won't destroy us and we can continue to exist. And others thought that this was a huge betrayal, and anyone who gave up their scriptures shouldn't have the name of Christian any longer. So that will emerge to be really important for Augustine. But very shortly after that, we have Constantine taking over, and then the famous Edict of Milan that essentially ends persecution of all Christians. And that's when the controversy, what's called the Donatist controversy in North Africa, really starts. And the much more conservative side of the church were the ones who thought that anyone who had given up the scriptures should not be called a Christian, and they had to be rebaptized. And then there was another side of the church that said, no, we should extend grace to everybody and realize that people were acting under duress. And that the second one was the more official side in the end. But North African Christianity, like a lot of rural areas, like we know today, tended to be fairly conservative in its religiosity. So this actually made it all the way up to the emperor's attention, and Constantine actually rules against these more conservative Donatists. But instead of destroying them, he insisted that toleration be extended to them. So they lived side by side, and it was often the case in a lot of these small towns in Africa that you had a Donatist church right next door to an Orthodox church, and with these two competing forms of Christianity right next to each other. So then I earlier mentioned the Council of Nicaea, and this was the big conference or the council in Nicaea, a town in Turkey, or what we know as Turkey now, where Constantine brings all the bishops together to try to decide what really is Orthodox Christianity and how should they define the divinity of Christ and the relationship of Jesus to the Father and this and that. And so maybe if you've been raised in the church, the Christian church, maybe you've heard of the Nicene Creed, and so that's the council that kind of defined that. So once Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire and the tables were turned, you would like to think that Christians would say, oh, we were persecuted and we're going to not do that. We're going to follow the golden rule and not do that to others. But of course, that didn't happen. And the Christians were often just as zealous to suppress the remnants of paganism. So the tables were really turned, and a lot of the temples were destroyed and looted or turned into Christian churches. So it was in this period that Augustine is born in Tagaste. I've heard it said different ways, but Tagaste was a small farming community in what we now know as Algeria, and his mother was Monica. And Monica had a huge influence on his life and how he experienced Christianity. And she was not exactly a Donatist, but she tended to be conservative in that way. And so, her Christian identity was everything to her. And so she spent a lot of hours, according to Augustine, in prayer for him and his soul. So because he's from a backwater and from a rather poor background, he doesn't really have money to go to school himself, but he gets a sponsor who does send him to school in Carthage. And there he begins. He's about 17 years old now, so he's basically gone off to college. And there he strikes up a relationship with a young woman. And this relationship lasts for 15 years. And this is not, how do I put this? This is not a sanctioned or legitimate relationship. It's because she was from a lower class than him. This would not have been a marriage that could have ever taken place. So it's really a love match. And they do have a son about a year later. And it becomes quite a tragic tale, really. But after he goes, he's a brilliant man and a great student. So he himself becomes a teacher rather quickly. He goes back to teach first in his hometown, then in Carthage, and then he gets promoted and goes on to Rome. And here's when he starts rejecting the Christianity of his own background. And this is a psychologically common experience, right? The young person who gets a wider view of the world starts rejecting the more closed-minded small town views that he's raised with. So he comes under the sway of some people who practice Manichaeism, and he becomes convinced that they're correct. So at the same time, we have this trouble brewing in the Roman Empire. The empire is actually being attacked by Goths and Visigoth tribes who are also Christian, but yet a different stripe. And so they defeat the Romans decisively at Adrianople in 378. And then just a few years later, we have, going back to Augustine moving to Milan to take up a very high-level official post. And here he studies Platonism and becomes very convinced that these philosophers have important things to say about the truth of the world and the nature of existence. But he also meets Bishop Ambrose, who's the bishop of Milan, and Ambrose has a very large influence on him. And just listening to his sermons, he starts to become more convinced again in the Christian way of seeing things. He starts to doubt his Manichaeism, and as he says famously, his heart starts to grow restless. So he's mulling all of this stuff over, and within a couple of years, and after talking with Ambrose at length and doing a lot of reading, and he's writing at the same time, writing in philosophy as well, Augustine has this famous so-called garden conversion. And the thing is, you probably know from reading the Confessions if you've done that, but the thing he really struggled with is his own sexual desire. So he finds some sort of a conversion experience there in the garden, and moves his life towards something like the true love of God. So as you can imagine, Monica is very, very happy that her son has come back home to his Christian roots. And then shortly after that, though, Monica dies. They're actually just outside of Rome by the seaside, and Augustine's heart broken, as you probably read about that in the Confessions. And then he goes back basically to live a simple life. He wants to be a monk. He wants to dedicate himself to living a simple Christian existence. But unfortunately, he's not able to do that, because within just a few years, you have this highly educated man who's had some experience with the world and had these high-level posts. It's very hard for him to stay isolated and live simply as a monk. So as it sometimes was done back then, the people basically insist that he become a priest, and then they make him a bishop in Hippo Regius, which is where he'll spend essentially the rest of his life. But it is important to stress that even though he becomes a bishop, and even though he has this huge influence in the world, he always identifies himself primarily as a monk. And so his life is taken up with a rhythm of prayer and reflection, and trying to live in harmony with the other people in the monastery. One of the problems, though, is now that he's a bishop, everybody knows a little bit about him. I guess small towns are like. And one of the things they know is that, hey, wait a minute, I thought Augustine was a Manichae. I thought that is he really orthodox? Is he really qualified to lead us? And so, as now the spiritual leader of Hippo Regius, he started to realize that he needs to explain to people the journey of his heart. And so this is the motivation for his autobiographical confessions, to prove to other folks that he, in fact, is a fully committed Christian at this point and worthy of being a spiritual leader. But he produces this remarkable book. It wasn't by any means the first autobiography, but it is different than other sort of intellectual biographies in how sort of emotionally revealing it is, how personal it is, how it contains just a lot of kind of dark and dirty stories about his background. You would think, I guess, a lot of the stuff that he wrote, even in today's world, wouldn't really impress a lot of people. They would think he was a hypocrite for having lived that way in the past. But as you read through the Confessions, you really get the sense that he's in a sense modeling what is it like to go through this internal change, and hoping that this can be convincing to others. So he moves on in his life as a bishop, and there's lots of other writings that he produces at this time, lots of ecclesial rulings, lots of sermons, lots of all this stuff that he does. And the Visigoths, who we met earlier, are now on the march again, and Alaric and his forces actually sack Rome in AD 420, which is a huge catastrophe, not only in the practical sense. I mean, they were there for 3 days, and there was a lot of looting and burning and killing and this and that, and then they kind of left, but much more like a symbolic event. The 1,000-year city of Rome, the impregnable city of Rome, the center of the world's meaning, is now simply one more city that's been sacked by outside forces, and not just outside forces, Christian forces. How is it that it's Christians that did this to Rome? And how do you make sense of that? So it was in response to this that he ends up writing his City of God Against the Pagans. That's the full title. And it's basically a large book to try to make religious sense of Rome's fall, and then to help Christians understand how this fits into the larger scheme of God's plan. And this was his big magnum opus, his big work. And then not too long after that gets published, he dies at age 75 in the year 430 AD. And actually he dies, it's interesting, he dies as the Visigoths are attacking Hippo Regius, his hometown. And so as was sometimes done with people who were considered to be saintly or saints, there was a big fear that his body would be stolen or taken by the attackers, and so they actually take his body to Sardinia, if I'm not mistaken. So finally he gets a trial again. And it's not that long afterwards that we have the last emperor of Rome in the West. Odoacer is another one of the Goth or Visigoth, I can't remember. But anyway, the last Roman Empire was Romulus Augustus in AD 476. And then to prime you for I guess you're still reading the Quran, I assume, in the syllabus. We have 100 years before the life of Muhammad and the beginnings of the Quran. So I hope that helped, in a sense, locate Augustine in time. Are there any questions or thoughts at this point? Okay. I'm going to share another PowerPoint if I can. So this is a question. What Britton Bishop is asking if there's a way to get the slides for this. I can certainly. I'll send this. I'll share it with whomever Katie, if you want to do that. And I can have to turn that other time thing into a set of slides, but I can easily do that. All right. So if I can, I'll talk a little bit. I'll talk you through some of these other slides on this PowerPoint, and this is kind of more an introduction to the texts themselves. So I have some goals for today. In this part, I want to continue to introduce Augustine, his world and his legacy. Then we'll look at the Confessions, and I'm trying to convince you that what we're looking at here is a hero's journey. I don't know about you. You're probably a little boring to think about hero's journeys. Maybe you've heard too much of those, but I think you have to understand this text in those ways. At least that will be helpful. And then we'll look at the city of God, and I want to show you how it's a sort of foundational epic for a brave new world. So just a map view of Augustine's world here. These little blue things are the marks of places that he spent significant time. Most of his time was spent in Hippo here on the northern coast of Africa. You see Carthage on the tip over here to the right, and in his hometown of Bagast. So that one big trip that he made when he got appointed to Rome, and then he ended up going to Milan, and then spent about 6 months in a retreat in Cassiacum, and then back to Ostia, where he departed back for North Africa after his mother died. So this is essentially his world, that most of it by far was just spent between Hippo, and occasionally he would go to Carthage for a bishop conference. This is a picture of Hippo Regis, or what's left of it. You can see the Basilica of St. Augustine up on the top left. We'll get back to that in a minute. But these are the ruins of the church and monastery where Augustine would have actually lived and lived his days as a monk and bishop. Look how weedy it is now. Another picture of that. Not a very big place, really. Smaller than a lot of our churches would be today. This quote is by a very famous church historian named Adolf von Harnack in his magnificent History of Dogma. But this quote gives us a little bit of a picture about how important Augustine is. The history of Haydn of dogmas in the West was so thoroughly dominated by Augustine from the beginning of the 5th century to the era of the Reformation that we might take this whole time as forming one period. I'm well aware that if you ask the average person in the street who Augustine was, they'll say, well, Augustine what? Who's that? Never heard of him. But I think we've forgotten, a big chunk of our history, and it's simply impossible to understand the Reformation, or in fact the world in which we still live, without sort of wrestling with Augustine. I have a question here from Rachel Pellis that says, well, Augustine mostly wrote about the pagans. What was the position of the Jews in Rome like during this time? Oh boy, you're stretching my expertise here. Essentially, as I understand, the Jews who were in diaspora at this time lived alongside Christians fairly well. I do know that as Christianity took over, because it was a Jewish sect, there were struggles for there were struggles for control of the local churches, and then gradual increasing conflict between Christians and the Jews over that struggle. And so there is what reads now to be anti-Semitism in the New Testament that the Christians really need to take seriously. But it might be helpful to remember that a lot of what reads to us as anti-Semitism now, at least back then, was more like two different sects struggling for control over who would be in charge of the church. And when the Christians often lost, then that was reflected even in the scriptures. And so like you even have like in John's gospel, Jesus talking about, or others in John's gospel talking about the Jews, as if there's some separate group. And of course, the Christians were all Jewish to begin with, as was Jesus himself. So it's a very troubled history because of the way the New Testament represents that. Then the New Testament sort of begins to underwrite what does develop into genuine anti-Semitism as Christianity takes power. A dumb question, not dumb, no dumb question. How do you pronounce Augustine? I've been saying it like Augustine, probably, right? So like St. Augustine in Florida. I can tell you that I pronounce it Augustine because that's how my first teacher pronounced it. I do hear people say it both ways. There's another silly reason why I say Augustine, that there was actually more than one St. Augustine. And when I was a student in Canterbury, there was a St. Augustine of Canterbury who was very important to the founding of that area. And so in my mind, I've always just said Augustine means Augustine of Hippo, and Augustine means Augustine of Canterbury. But you can say it however you like. I always feel like maybe it's a little bit snooty to say Augustine. I don't know. But people like you do these things. All right. So I don't know whether this does it for you, but Augustine's significance, it's hard to put on one slide. Maybe we just look at the Catholic University of America's 30 volumes of Augustine's collected works. He wrote a lot. He wrote 5 million words that we have. These volumes represent all kinds of genres. And even the massive City of God is just a drop in the bucket, in a sense of its overall production. And so he really had an outside voice, and that must be representative of having an outside brain, because like St. Thomas Aquinas later on, they're both very famous for their ability to dictate their books to tribes that they were going very quickly. So I always am so humbled by how these folks knew all these classical references, knew the scriptural references, and could essentially write by talking. Really remarkable gift. Here's another indication of how important Augustine is to the life of the West and the life of the church in particular. This is the famous cathedra in Rome. Maybe you've heard that sometimes the Pope speaks ex cathedra. That means from the chair of St. Peter. I don't know if you can see from this picture, but that's a chair, or at least there is a chair inside there. I understand, like an old wooden chair that's been the sculpture around it to protect it. And then if you look closely, you see that the legs of this chair are held up by what were regarded as the 4 important doctors of the church, the scholars of the church, from left to right: Ambrose, Athanasius, John Chrysostom, and Augustine on the far right. So even in the Vatican, in the St. Peter's in Rome, you see the symbolic representation of how central Augustine was to, say, holding up the fundamental teachings of Western Christianity. And some of these teachings, and these are just some of the more important ideas that he gave to us, for better or for worse, this great synthesis between Jewish and Christian historical theology and Platonic philosophy. When he was in Milan and he was reading Neoplatonic philosophy and very much taken by it, he felt within himself that there was a possibility of bringing all this stuff together, that the philosophers, at least the strain of philosophers, were right about many things. And that, and this, I don't know, that's just kind of unusual, not unusual, but it's not always to be assumed, right? There are plenty of religious traditions that say the only truths are had within our scriptures and all other truths are not truths at all. But Augustine wasn't like that. He had a much bigger heart and a bigger head. And he realized that Christianity would benefit, the truth would benefit in his mind if he could draw from the depth of all sources, certainly the scriptures, first and foremost, but also the great philosophers who could speak to ideas that were compatible with Christian thinking. So what we have going forward with Augustine is not simply a Christian theology, but an adoption of the West by Platonic philosophy or of Platonic philosophy. And this is why, even in the 20th century, the great, I think it was Wittgenstein who said that all the philosophy of the West can be summed up as footnotes to Plato. And so this is it. I mean, this is Augustine who sort of cements that legacy for us. And one of the reasons why we still take Plato so seriously today. He also had a number of influential teachings, or his versions of these teachings, the way he talked about them became kind of the way the church talked about them: the original sin, the doctrine of predestination, the philosophy of time, the just war theory, which might be relevant today. In fact, I'm finding that in my philosophy classes, I really want to spend some time with my students now on just war theory. When is war justified, when is it not? And Augustine's particular understanding of the Holy Trinity became very influential, and in fact became sort of official doctrine at later church synods. Another thing that Augustine gives to us is this experience that you may know of as within Christianity, sex is the prototypical sin. What I mean by that is that, have you ever noticed that Christians talk a lot about sex and they worry a lot about that? Far more, frankly, than the New Testament worries about it. The New Testament says a lot more about how we handle our wealth than about how we handle our sexual organs. I shouldn't say it that way, but you get the idea. But Augustine, because he himself wrestled with lust so much and talked about it so openly in his Confessions, and then talked about it in the City of God and made it integral to his understanding of original sin, sex becomes, in some ways, for Christianity, particularly Western Christianity, kind of the focal point, the prototypical sin. But what Augustine gives us, maybe that's more life-giving here, is that he is able to bequeath to Christendom as a whole and into the West this idea of human history as a Christian history. And by that, what I mean is that history has a purpose under the providence of God, a purpose that's moral and a purpose that's eschatological. Eschatological is the fancy college word for the end time. So that history is going someplace and it's going towards someplace on purpose. So instead of history being just one damn thing after another, history has this kind of arrow quality to it, guided by God. All right, so let me just talk a little bit about the Confessions then. This is a quote that actually the scholar Peter Brown brought to my attention. I wanted to start with this with the Confession, because if you do read the Confessions, and if you're at all a sensitive soul, if you're able to appreciate what Augustine's done here, you recognize how sensitive Augustine is as a human being. And at one point in Book 4, he says, in a moment of self-reflection, how can one soul contain within itself feelings so much at variance? Humanity is a great mystery, Lord. You count the hairs on our head, and not one of them escapes your reckoning. Yet our hairs are more easily counted than our feelings and the emotions of our heart. So what Augustine does for us explicitly here is speak to something that I experience in my life, that I'm not very simple. I'd like sometimes to be more simple, but I find that when I look inside, there's this great massive confusion of emotions and thoughts and conflicts and different desires. Some desires more important than others. Some desires I put aside, some desires put me aside. And so this great sort of cauldron or bubbling mass of feelings and experiences is part of the human condition. And most people who wrote autobiographies up to this point were not nearly so candid about the inner turmoil of their lives. And so if Augustine did do something for us here, it's that he gave us a language to speak about these inner struggles. And whatever else you think. I think that's kind of remarkable and beautiful. So just 4 basic points about the Confessions that I want you to hold on to if you can. First of all, this is a confession. It says it right there in the title, right? What is a confession? A confession is the pouring of the heart out to God, in this case. If you open up the Confessions on the first page, I don't know if you noticed this, maybe you talk about this in your preceptorial. It says, Augustine says in the second paragraph, grant me, Lord, to know and understand whether a man is first to pray to you for help or to praise you, or whether he must know you, and so on. Grant me, Lord. Who's he writing this to? He's writing it to God. This whole book is a big prayer that he's addressing to God. It's a confession. And the chief audience here, obviously he wants other people to overhear it, but his chief audience here is God. He didn't invent that kind of genre, but he takes it further than anybody else did. Another thing is that this is a hero's journey that has a quest and an adventure and various downfalls and then a resolution at the end. It's just going to be a hero's journey of the soul rather than something involving swords and monsters. And like most heroes, he travels with friends. Whether it's Frodo and his band of friends, or Odysseus and Aeneas. Augustine, maybe if you notice when reading the Confessions, how often he talks about his friendships as the people who were accompanying him along the way, fighting their own battles. And like most heroes, Augustine's trying to find his way home, fundamentally, just like Odysseus. So he says this right at the very beginning when he writes, "Our hearts find no peace until they rest in you." And so this is just this long, restless journey of the soul that follows his hero's journey. And he talks about rest a lot. You were faithful to your promises. Remember, he's talking to God here, and for his country house, where we found our rest in you. This is referring to, I think, to the home that he got to stay in Cassicassium. And later on in the Confessions, he says, when I read the next verse, a loud cry broke from my heart. In peace and friendliness, I will sleep. I will take my rest in the eternal God. Oh, the joy of these words. So reading the Psalm, he finds some rest for the soul. And then even after, I don't know whether you're reading into the last part of the Confession, but the last several books are all about this sort of spiritual interpretation of Genesis. Even here, he takes time to really talk about the Sabbath, the Sabbath of the seventh day of creation. So you can see this theme of the search for rest throughout the Confessions. And as I said earlier, it's important to remember that he thought of himself first and foremost as a praying monk who happened to have the duties of a bishop and a theologian and leader of the church. And he was so busy with his life. He produced so much. It does raise the question, did he ever get the rest that he actually was looking for, even after his death? And it is a little sad and ironic that even as he dies, he's not allowed to just rest where he is, but they pick his body up and they take it to Sardinia, and then it goes on various other travels. So those of you who are worried about whether Augustine ever got his rest, I have this to show to you. This is a famous reliquary in the Church of St. Augustine that's there in Hippo now. And you can see this is a statue of him laying down, but right there in the middle is his arm. This is actually Augustine's arm bone, at least that's what we're told. And I'm going to believe it. And I'd like to think that at least his arm finally gets to rest in Hippo. So with just a little more detail, this hero's journey that he's on is actually recapitulating the hero journey of Jesus. And if you ever have read the New Testament in the Gospels, you may remember that Jesus had a little hero journey of his own. And this is the version of the Gospel of Mark. After he's baptized, the Spirit immediately drives Jesus, into the wilderness. He was in the wilderness for 40 days, tempted by Satan, and he was with the wild beasts, and the angels waited on him. In the other Gospels, you get far more details about this. I say that wrongly. It's not so much details. It's elaboration. Let's put it that way. Elaboration on the story of Jesus, because Mark's Gospel was earlier than Matthew and Luke by most accounts. Most scholars think that, and so Mark gave a short story. Later writers elaborate on it a little bit. And you may remember that when he was in the wilderness, in the longer version, first of all, Jesus encounters. Remember, he's fasting for 40 days, and so Satan comes to him with the temptation of bread. And aren't you hungry, Jesus? Don't you want to eat some bread? And Jesus says, no, Satan, it is written, one does not live by bread alone. So he recognizes this temptation of the flesh. Then Satan comes to him another time and gives him a temptation of knowledge. So Jesus, don't you want to know that you are the Son of God? So if you want to know that, here's a test for you. Go up to the top of the mountain, go up to the top of the temple and throw yourself off. If you are the Son of God, then God will save you, and then you will know. So it's a temptation of knowledge. And again, Jesus said, get away from me, Satan, because it's written, do not put the Lord God to the test. So Jesus wins the battle of the temptation to know, for knowledge. And then finally, Satan comes to him and says, if you're the Son of God, then you can command all armies and you can be in charge of the world and you have all this power. That's basically the temptation of ambition. And then again, Jesus wins that battle with Satan and says, away with you, Satan, for it's written, worship the Lord your God and only serve him. So in Jesus's hero's journey into the wilderness, he just wins it. He wins all three of his little temptations. So, but in the structure of the Confessions, Augustine is very clever about the way he writes it, because what he does is he shows how his life is actually a recapitulation of Jesus' experience of the wilderness, except every place that Jesus won, Augustine lost. He wasn't able to meet the temptations. So in book 2, the pleasures of the flesh, the bread, which for him was sexuality, he lost himself to that. And then his temptation of curiosity or knowledge when he was a student in Carthage, and he becomes a follower of a Gnostic sect, Manichaeism, he loses that battle. And then his temptation to ambition and power. Augustine was climbing the ladder of success and becoming this great scholar as a rhetorician in Rome and Milan, and he loses that battle. He becomes swelled up in pride. And how does Augustine understand sin? It's actually very simple given all of this. And this quote from the Confession says, but my sin was this, that I looked for pleasure, beauty, and truth. In other words, bodily pleasure, beauty, knowledge and beauty, and ambition. I guess it's not expected parallel. Not in him, that is God, but in myself and God's other creatures. And the search led me instead to pain and confusion. So an error. So for Augustine, sin is a mistake. It's a mistake that people make when they look for their solution to their life in something other than God. And so it's just a fundamental point of mistake or confusion. So Jesus is a hero who defeated all these temptations. Augustine is writing in the Confessions that he encountered the same temptations as Jesus, in fact, in the same order, but instead of winning, like Jesus did, he falls. And so then he has to be cured of them in reverse order, right? And then that's the rest of the next several chapters until finally he comes to a tree in the garden where he confronts his original sin. Notice the allusion to Genesis here. When Augustine has his conversion experience, it's not in a living room, it's not in a church, it's in a garden, like the Garden of Eden. And he's confronting his original sin, and for him, his original sin is sexuality, and that's where he finally has his conversion. So it's is this strict autobiography? Yes, no, it's stylistically written to tell a certain story about his being cured from these mistakes. So I don't know that I need to go into a lot more, but he gets cured of his ambition first, and then he gets cured of his curiosity. He realizes that the Manichees and Faustus, Manichean teacher, are full of error, and this is where he meets Ambrose. And then he finally gets cured of lust, what he calls his disordered love, and he gets repulsed by other physical things, the temptations of the body, like the gladiatorial games. And then very sadly and frankly scandalously, from our modern sensibilities, maybe for his own, this woman that he had been in companionship with for 15 years and had this son, he dismisses her and sends her back to Africa. I think this is just not something that we can defend, obviously. But for him, she represented a failure of lust, a relationship based on the body rather than one that's more spiritual. And some of it was too that as he wanted to become a monk, he realized he couldn't marry at all. It's actually a little more complicated even than that, in that he puts his female companion back on a boat to Africa, partly because he's going to get like an official sanctioned, socially approved marriage, but he gets engaged, believe it or not, to an 11-year-old young woman. And then he basically has to wait for her to grow up until she's a marriageable age. But he gets engaged to an 11-year-old, which I know is very strange, and then puts this long-time female companion away. But then he breaks off the second engagement when he realizes, when he has a conversion, he realizes he wants to be a monk instead. So to recapitulate where we've been here, unlike Jesus, Augustine has fallen to the three temptations, and he sinned against the entire Trinity, which I had to skip a little bit of, but you get the idea. By the end of Book 8 of the Confessions, he's actually been healed of his ambition and his curiosity, and now this third step, how will he be healed of his disordered love in the garden? And in fact, very interestingly, it's by an encounter with a goddess of some kind. So in book 8, section 11, Augustine says, I could see the chaste beauty of continence. And here he's picturing a goddess of continence, of sexual chastity, in all her serene, unsullied joy, as she modestly beckoned me to cross over and to hesitate no more. So instead of a woman that he has, an image of a woman that he seems to lust after, have no control over his lust, now he sees an image of a goddess-like figure that comes to him in this garden, and she is chaste and beckons him to come over to the pure side. And so then this very, very famous passage when he, quoting Romans 13, not in reveling and drunkenness, not in debauchery and licentiousness, not in quarreling and jealousy, instead putting on the Lord Jesus Christ, and making no provision for the flesh to gratify its desires. This is the 8th century painting of the conversion of St. Augustine by Fra Angelico. So Augustine gets reborn after his conversion. He quits his job as a rhetorician. He leaves town. He sits. He reads scripture. He pours into the Bible. Then he has a bath. I mean that as a joke. He gets baptized. He has a holy bath. And in fact, actually, baptismal theology often talked about baptism as a holy bath. And the idea was that, at least in the early church, you should be baptized in enough water that you could theoretically drown in. So if you've seen baptisms today, a lot of churches sprinkle a little water on a baby's head or something like this. This is not the ancient practice. You can see this 15th century painting of St. Augustine's baptism by St. Ambrose. And he's in a baptismal font here that is going to be full of water. And he's naked. I hope you noticed that too. That was also part of the baptismal ritual in the early church. Because it's a rebirth, and you don't put clothes on when you're being born. Most babies don't. And then his mom dies, and he grieves his mom. And then the last few books of the Confessions, Augustine is now writing from the position not as a sinner, not as a convert, but as a bishop. And he is interpreting the opening chapters of Genesis, and in that he philosophizes on things like memory and time. And this is work that he'll continue on in the City of God. So those of you who have a chance, if you haven't done so already, meet with the precept group. These are some questions you might ask about the Confessions. This thing is Augustine's experience of the divided self a common human experience, or is it a product only of religious suffering? I find this very interesting. William James, in the early 20th century, talked about the divided self and how sometimes we feel like there's more than one self vying for control. And certainly Augustine seemed to experience that. Is that just a religious thing, or is that something that can happen to non-religious people too? I think that's an interesting question to think about. Augustine, is our will free? Is it somewhat free? What forces are at work that make us feel divided? Augustine will emphasize that the will is free. And then the questions like this, are ambition, curiosity, and lust still problems in a secular age, or is, again, that only relevant to a religious mind? Ambition, for example, is that a wrong thing in any way, even for a non-religious person, or is that something good? So I'll stop there. I feel like I'm rambling on here a little bit. I hope this is helpful to you. How about an emoji? Can I get some emojis? How you doing, everybody? Are you still hanging in? Anybody there? Oh, good. Doing great. Good. It's so weird talking to you through the screen and not seeing you. All right. Anybody have any questions that you want to ask? Magical lecture. Oh, that can't be true, but thank you very much. All right. So many of you probably read, was respect on beliefs in the times of Augustine? That is to say, was everyone either a pagan or a Christian? There's some people have mixed beliefs or even lack of belief. Absolutely. Yeah, the world was a complicated place back then. Like I tried to say, even Christians came in all different stripes and sizes, just like they do today. Maine is not a very religious state. In fact, by some measures, it's the least religious state in the whole country. But what that means, I think, practically speaking, is that a lot of us have this idea that Christianity speaks as some sort of unity. All Christians are like this, or all Christians are like that. Man, all you got to do is travel the world, and as you see how complicated it is. I took some students to Jerusalem, or actually to Israel a couple years ago on an academic trip, and I'd never been before. But the central church in Jerusalem, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where Jesus is supposed to have been raised, that church is actually divided into 4 quadrants, and each quadrant is controlled by a different branch of Christianity. And if you're from one branch, they have to share the times that they can use the various places, because if you don't share it, then they just fight each other all the time. And in fact, there's this, I kid you not, there's a ladder, an old wooden ladder that's been propped up against the wall there for centuries, and no one can touch it because they don't know which group of Christians put it up there, and no one wants to take it down so they can avoid a fight. So maybe that's a little off the topic, but yeah, people were all over the place. There was a long-standing history of tension, though, between Christians and pagans. As you can imagine, the pagans who had been the default religion of Rome found themselves displaced under a Christian Rome, and found themselves now persecuted, if not officially, then often unofficially, and their properties taken over, their beliefs set aside, and like any people, they would have felt enormous grief at the pain of losing their tradition in that way. So yeah, all kinds of folks, it's just fascinating to study that part of history, religious history. It's hard to have a simple mindset about religion once you get into that work. I'm tempted to, maybe with a little bit of caution. There's a film that I would sometimes show to my honors class called Agora, and it's a Hollywoodized kind of thing, and so it's not exactly historical, but it's also just kind of illuminative. Agora is the story of in late antiquity in Ephesus, Alexandria, and she was a philosopher, and the film is a kind of a story of how Alexandria was divided between the Christians and the pagans and the Jews at the time, and how those 3 different groups went to war against each other, and the Christians ended up burning down the great library at Alexandria, and had that not happened, so much of the knowledge of the ancient world would still be with us. But that library loss alone was a catastrophic event, and was one of the precipitating factors for what became known as the Dark Ages, an age where a lot of the knowledge of the classical world was simply lost to the West. So a lot of anti-intellectualism, I'm sorry to say, within Christian history. Fortunately, we don't have that any longer, right? Okay. So I don't have a lot of time. The City of God, for those of you who are reading that, is a much less approachable book than the Confessions, and I understand why people would be drawn to the Confessions more. It's more interesting and more modern way for us to hear a story about a person's inner struggle that we can relate to than this this massive volume where Augustine's trying to interpret the whole of human history. It's just a big thing to try to get a hold of. But there are some themes in the City of God that are worth paying attention to. First of all, that the City of God is Augustine's foundational epic. It presents a grand narrative of history in which everyone plays a part. It's really a history of the world, and its original sin, according to Augustine, that sets the plot for this narrative that is to come and the one in which the world is living. So, I'll call this first theme as a tale of two cities. And if you just stop and think about it, this book was written in response to the Visigoths' attack on the sacking of Rome. And so for Christians, it was the best of times, right? Because Christianity was now, after Constantine, the official religion of the empire, but it was also the worst of times because of the sacking of Rome. And so how is it that they make sense of this? And this really was, I hesitate to use the word, but I mean, it was like the atomic bomb blast of their age. For Rome to be sacked, it was such a symbol, probably far more upsetting to people outside of Rome in some way for its symbolic reason than the people of Rome themselves. And Augustine wrote about it here. In the meantime, Rome was overwhelmed by the invasion of the Goths under their king Alaric and by the force of a great disaster. The worshippers of the many false gods, whom we call by well-established name of pagans, attempting to attribute Rome's troubles to the Christian religion, began more sharply and bitterly than usual to blaspheme the true God. So in the wake of Rome's fall by Christians, or sacking by Christians, the Visigoths, a lot of the pagan philosophers and writers of the time saying, look, this is what Christianity is all about. The reason why Rome was sacked was because we're not being faithful to the Roman gods. And so one of the things that's prompting Augustine is a worry about a backlash against Christianity and a resurgence of paganism in the light of this event. And how then can he, as a Christian bishop, make sense of this event and defend Christianity against these accusations? So he's also very consciously drawing on Virgil here, but with a difference. So in classical thinking, you probably are then become aware of these ideas of fortune and fate, really important. And Virgil says it right at the beginning of the Aeneid, I sing of warfare and a man at war. From the seacoast of Troy in early days, he came to Italy by destiny, right? So destiny is driving his whole story. And remember how he said to Dido, he said, I have to go back, I have to go to Italy, I have to leave you. I sailed to Italy, not of my own free will. So this sense that everything is controlled by destiny and fate, unfortunately for Dido, of course. But for Augustine, that's wrongful thinking, because if God's in charge, it's not fortune or fate, it's providence. And providence is essentially the same idea of fortune and fate, but instead of it being some blind, force that affects us, it is a guiding of history by God. And by the way, that idea comes to us from the Hebrew scriptures, from Moses and the liberation of the people from the slavery in Egypt and all of that. It's really Jewish thinking, Hebrew thinking, that sees history as meaningful, that there's something in history that tells us about what God is up to. And so this is a legacy that Augustine takes seriously, takes to heart, and writes. This book couldn't exist unless he understood history in that way. And so as he says in chapter 5 of the City of God, the cause then of the greatness of the Roman Empire was neither fortune nor fate. On the contrary, divine providence alone explains the establishment of kingdoms among men. And to those who speak from fate, but mean by fate the will and power of God, they should keep their conception but change their expression. And so God is the Lord both of stars and men. In other words, you can't find the future by astronomy and astrology and so on. And so what Augustine was giving us here was a Game of Thrones. Which God should people follow? Which God should be trusted? Which God should be the future in this time of uncertainty? The old gods, Zeus on his throne, or Jesus sitting on his throne? And you can't deny the similarity of the iconography here. The Christians borrowed their visual conceptions, of course, from what they knew culturally. And so do we, by the way. And so I'm just going to move ahead a little bit quickly because I'm very conscious of the time here. But Augustine gets a letter. It's a letter from a friend saying we need help understanding this. And so Augustine sets upon a 10-year project of writing an answer. Again, he's responding explicitly to Virgil. So I hope that you learned already that Virgil is, in a sense, trying to write a foundational epic for the Roman people. Augustine knows this, and Augustine's taking Virgil's idea and writing a foundational epic for Christians, or from a Christian world, a Christian point of view, and actively referencing Virgil here. So you pay attention to how often he mentions Virgil. And then he draws this metaphor or analogy of two cities. He's not the first one to do this. The two different cities representing two different kinds of humanity. This was, like in the New Testament, the city of Babylon in the book of Revelation is contrasted with the New Jerusalem that comes out of the sky. But here is a slide that you can see. This is kind of like some of the many things that he covers in the City of God, where he compares these two cities, the city of earth versus the city of God. Each one has a different story to tell. One's founded by Cain, one's founded by Abel. One is analogous to Babylon, one's analogous to Jerusalem. One draws human loyalty towards the self or to devil and demons. Another one draws human loyalty to God. And they have different characters, they have a different glory, and a different political system, and a different destiny. One to eternal punishment and one to eternal happiness. So the City of God then is really, and I think I want to stop here because it's just been going on, but it's a story of these two cities, and the city of people, or the city of the devil, and then the city of God's people. And it may well look like, with the Visigoths attacking and history up for grabs, it may well look like Christians are uncertain about themselves, but the way that he wants Christians to understand themselves is that they're like the sheep and the goats. And the sheep and the goats, they live together, they graze together, but in the end, the shepherd comes and separates the sheep from the goats. And so if you're living through a time of trouble, if everything seems muddled, well, that's okay. But we know who's writing the story in his mind, God, and we know where that story is going. And in the meantime, Christians are refugees in the world in which they live. They don't really belong in the world. They belong, they're citizens of the world to come, a world that's still in formation under God. And this is actually, I just thought it might be fitting. This is a picture of refugees from the Ukraine, fleeing Ukraine. And so the Christians should understand themselves in the same mold as Abel, of Abraham, of Israel, the people of Israel in the desert, of Jesus and his disciples who wandered around, the Apostle Paul who wandered around, Odysseus wandered around, Lucius wandered around, Aeneas wandered around. All these folks, you're like them, that your life isn't, it's funny for somebody to say this who basically stayed in one place most of his life, but spiritually speaking, you're wanderers, you don't really belong, you're on a journey, and we know where the journey's going. And that was his answer to what happened in Rome when it was sacked and how people can make sense of the world that they're experiencing today. So I'll stop that. I've left, I hope, a little bit of time if someone has any other questions they might want to ask. What was the chair called that Augustine and the three others lifted up? That's the Cathedra of St. Peter. The Cathedral, I can type it in. So have you ever heard of cathedral, right? That's simply a church that has a bishop's chair in it, right? But there was one original bishop, the Bishop of St. Peter, or the preeminent bishop. Any other thoughts, worries, questions, concerns? Oh, wait. Oh, that makes sense. Good. I'm glad. Have you had good discussions about this so far in your groups, or have you not had the chance to do that yet? Chris, I don't know if you can answer that question.
Yeah, we certainly have, and we will have more discussions. That was a great lecture. There was so much in there and so many provocative ideas for us to talk about. So thank you very much.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Has there been a lot of change to the historical timeline like the one we saw at the beginning? Maybe can you clarify that question? I'm not sure what you mean, and you can unmute and maybe just ask it to me so I can be sure I understand what you're asking.
Yeah, I mean, just like, has there been like a lot of debate on like when these events took place, or is it something that's more kind of like set in stone?
I think those dates that I gave you from that period of time are fairly well established. Was there anyone in particular that caught your eye as a little swirly?
Not really. I just think it's kind of like interesting because like growing up Christian, it's like kind of like just don't, we're told just kind of like don't question these so much. So it's interesting to see this in like a historical context.
Yeah. I mean, Augustine's got a whole different historical record in mind that isn't very historical by our standards. But yeah, that the 3033 AD is roughly the time when Jesus died. That's pretty well established now. I always think it's interesting to ask this question. Why is it that Christians begin counting year one from what they thought was Jesus' birth? Why didn't they count it from the date of Jesus' death? Like in the Islamic calendar, year one is the year of the Hajj, right? Basically, a religion can choose whatever it wants to for year one. Why did they choose the birth of Jesus rather than the death? And it turns out to be that it was basically a decision of a monk named Dennis the Rapagite. What would Augustine think about this honor sequence? He didn't seem to like liberal arts. Contraire, he did. He loved the liberal arts. In fact, maybe you can remember if you read the Confessions that he says that his mind lit up when he read Cicero. And in fact, it's confounding to scholars because the book that he references, having read the Hortensius, is actually a book that was lost to history. So everybody's like, what was it that made Augustine light up in his study of the classics and the philosophers? So yeah, I do want to emphasize that Augustine was very Christian. Of course, he was a bishop, but he also was deeply knowledgeable about philosophy. And he had no problem criticizing philosophers where he thought they were wrong, but he knew them. He knew enough about them to criticize them intelligently. And actually, a lot of what we know about the pre-Socratics, maybe you read some of the pre-Socratics, a lot of what we know about pre-Socratic came from quotations from Augustine and from other people like him. So they preserve the memory of these folks for us when otherwise that history was lost.
I do remember there being some passages where he specifically says like saying bad things about the liberal arts or like how it takes you away from God. I do remember passages in Confessions that at least what's that about?
Yeah, see if you can find those for me, and you can send them to me if you want, and maybe I can see if there's a broader context there. Obviously, he didn't believe that he knows the philosophers, he studied the philosophers, but he doesn't believe the philosophers will lead to truth. He thinks that Christianity will lead to truth, so that he's definitely critical in that respect. And I suppose he probably believes that if you've only got so many hours in the day and you have to study one, then put the philosophers aside and only study the Christian tradition. Is there an Eastern equivalent of the temptations that Augustine encountered? Eastern equivalent. Well, it might be helpful just to remember that Augustine lived before. Do you mean like Eastern religious, like Buddhist and Hindu, that sort of thing? Or do you mean Eastern, like Eastern Christian? But let's just assume that you mean Eastern religious, like Buddhist. And here we just think about the life of the Buddha. You may remember that the Buddha was born in great wealth, and he realized that when he finally left his palace and he saw the suffering and death all around, that all of this great wealth that he was born, this privilege into which he was born, meant nothing, and that set him off on his great spiritual journey. So yeah, definitely there's at least one parallel right there. If that's the question, what you mean. But for the 83 of you left, thank you for listening for such a long time. It's been nice to be able to talk about Augustine with you. I hope that you find it somewhat inspiring to go back to and to think about.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Perfect.